Usually when we talk about like a medical diagnosis,
Yeah.
there is this comforting expectation of precision.
Right. Yeah. Like it's a hard science.
Exactly. It's like engineering. You break your arm, you go to the hospital,
Yeah.
and the x-ray shows that jagged white line on the film. And the doctor just points at it and says, there it is. There's the fracture.
Right. It's objective. Nobody argues with the x-ray.
Undeniable.
Yeah.
But then you step into the world of modern cultural commentary, into the psychology of these massive demographic shifts we're seeing, and suddenly that x-ray machine is just like completely broken.
Oh, completely. It is the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters.
Yeah. We are looking at an entire demographic today that feels a fracture, but the mainstream medical establishment of our culture, they refuse to even look at the x-ray.
And that tension right there, that exact friction between what is felt by this demographic and what is officially acknowledged by the culture, is exactly why the text we are studying today is so fascinating as an artifact.
It really is.
We are essentially opening up a tactical manual. This is a highly systematic document written specifically for a demographic that feels completely erased or honestly actively pathologized by modern society.
Exactly. And before we get into the incredibly dense, controversial text we are unpacking today, I need to remind you, the listener, to like and subscribe to this deep dive right now. Seriously, hit that button.
Definitely do that.
Because if you are part of the men's rights movement or the red pill manosphere, or if you simply want to deeply understand the history of Western institutions before they were, as today's author puts it, captured by feminists and Marxists, well, this deep dive is going to absolutely blow your mind.
It's a heavy one.
It is. The book we are dissecting is called Pattern Recognition for Men, Ungelded Androcentrism by Conrad Reicher. And I'm telling you up front, if this demographic sounds like you, or if you want to understand the architectural blueprint of this entire movement, this is an absolute must-buy.
Yeah, it really lays out the whole framework.
So you need to check Amazon, Kindle, and Google Play Books right now to grab a copy, and make sure you follow the author at Conrad and Reicher on Substack.
But, and this is important, let's establish our ground rules right at the top, because the context of how we approach this is crucial.
Oh, right, yeah.
This text contains highly politically charged content. It is a searing, relentless critique of feminism, of cultural Marxism, and of modern Western institutions, literally from the family courts all the way to the universities.
So we need to be clear.
Right. We are not taking sides today. We are not endorsing the author's worldview, nor are we here to condemn it. Our mission is strictly analytical.
We're just looking at the mechanics.
Exactly. We're here to impartially unpack the logic, the statistical data, and the really deep philosophical arguments that Conrad Reicher uses. We're treating this book as an artifact under a microscope so you can understand the exact mechanics of Reicher's claims.
Right. We are looking at the engine of his argument to see how the pistons fire, basically. Because whether you personally agree with him or not, the underlying architecture of his argument is asking a massive civilization level question.
And what would you say that big question is?
Well, the big question of this deep dive is this. What happens when a massive demographic decides the entire system is permanently structurally rigged against them? And this is the key part. What does their precise blueprint for exiting that system actually look like?
Yeah, the exit strategy. And what is truly compelling about Reicher's approach here is that he doesn't begin with the macroeconomic data.
He doesn't start with the charts and graphs.
No, or the legal statutes. He begins by diagnosing the internal psychological state of his reader. He starts with this condition he terms the phantom limb.
The phantom limb. I love this as a medical metaphor because, for those who aren't familiar, if someone loses an arm in an accident, the brain's neuroplasticity doesn't just instantly update the map of the body.
Right, the brain still thinks it's there.
Exactly. The brain still sends signals down those neural pathways expecting to find a hand. You feel an itch or an ache right in the empty air where the limb used to be. And Reicher uses this neurological phenomenon as a metaphor for like a cultural amputation.
Precisely. Reicher argues that modern men are experiencing the psychological residue of an actual historical and cultural amputation.
Wow.
They're walking around feeling the ghost of something that has been forcibly severed. They feel their heritage, their patrilineal transmission of values, and their traditional roles as builders and protectors have just been removed.
Stripped away.
Yeah. He writes that men sense this constant, low level, he calls it the background radiation of falsehood. They are watching their culture actively celebrate their displacement while simultaneously demanding their continued subservience and productivity.
So it's that intense cognitive dissonance. You're being told you are the oppressor, but you wake up every day feeling completely powerless.
Exactly. And his core argument, really the foundational thesis of the entire book, is that this sensation isn't paranoia.
It's not just them going crazy.
Right. It isn't some toxic social construct. It is pattern recognition.
Okay, let's pull the thread on that, because pattern recognition isn't just a throwaway phrase here. I mean, it's literally the title of the book. It's the central operating system of his entire philosophy.
It is the lens through which he views everything.
And he frames this not as some modern internet culture idea, but as a hardwired biological imperative, right?
Yes. He frames it as the original human superpower. He says this was forged over 300,000 years of hominid evolution. I mean, think about the mechanics of human survival.
Sure, back on the savannah.
Right. Your ancestors didn't survive because they were the strongest or the fastest animals. They survived because their neocortex evolved to recognize patterns. They observed which cave reliably housed predators, which weather patterns preceded a freeze.
Which plant was poisonous?
Exactly. Riker argues that recognizing reality as it objectively manifests is the defining trait of the male biological imperative.
And he claims that modern society, specifically the institutional establishment, demands that men essentially devolve. It demands that they actively suppress their own evolutionary hardware, just ignoring these observable statistical patterns in the name of, like, political correctness or equity.
That's the crux of his whole epistemological argument. And he categorizes the awareness of these patterns into a hierarchy of pills.
Ah, the pills. Obviously borrowing from the Matrix here.
Obviously. The audience is probably well aware of the Matrix metaphor, but Riker expands on it by treating these not just as internet slang, but as distinct cognitive frameworks.
Right, he maps out 4 specific states. You start with the blue pill, which he calls the sedative slumber of the Gelded age.
Quite the phrasing.
Yeah, he doesn't hold back. This is the guy who just accepts the mainstream narrative wholesale. He believes the HR department is his friend. He believes the family courts are fair. He just goes along to get along.
Ignorance is bliss.
Basically. But then Riker introduces the purple pill. And I found this fascinating because he doesn't call it an awakening. He calls it a purgatory.
Yes, the purple pill is a state of profound psychological torment in Riker's model. This is the man whose pattern recognition has kicked in.
He sees the X-ray.
Exactly. He looks at the world and he sees the divorce statistics. He sees the institutional bias in education and corporate hiring. But his cognitive framework is still fundamentally tied to the old world.
So he's still playing by the old rules.
Right. So he tries to fix the system from within. He tries to negotiate with a rigged game. He votes for conservative politicians, hoping they'll roll back 50 years of institutional capture. Or he tries to, logically debate a corporate diversity committee.
Which Riker thinks is useless.
Completely. Riker views this as a tragic waste of male energy because the purple pill man fundamentally misunderstands the nature of the parasite.
He thinks he's in a debate, but he's actually in a hostage situation.
Precisely. Which leads to the third state, the black pill. And we have to spend a moment here because Riker spends a significant portion of his opening chapters vehemently rejecting the black pill.
Yeah, the black pill is basically the terminal diagnosis. It observes all the same data the purple pill sees, the demographic collapse, the institutional hostility, but it concludes in absolute nihilism and despair.
Total surrender.
Yeah, it's the belief that the collapse of Western civilization is totally inevitable, that female nature is inherently destructive, and that any resistance is utterly futile. It's the ultimate give up and rot mentality.
And Riker attacks this mindset with incredible philosophical ferocity. He states that the black pill is a sin against the life force itself.
Oh.
He calls it intellectual cowardice masquerading as realism. He argues that simply observing a negative pattern without attempting to build a counterstructure is an evolutionary failure.
Which brings us to his ultimate prescription, the true core of his thesis, the red pill. But Riker reclaims this term from the broader internet culture.
He does. He doesn't just mean waking up to female psychology.
Right. He defines the red pill as the active, deliberate architecture of rebirth. And the primary tool of this rebirth, interestingly, is formal logic.
Yes. Riker is trying to arm his readers with the intellectual weaponry of the ancients, basically. He bases his framework on the trivium.
The classical educational method.
Exactly. Grammar, logic, and rhetoric. He goes all the way back to the syllogisms of Aristotle. Riker's argument is that modern discourse isn't argumentation at all. It's what he calls alchemy.
Alchemy, like the medieval pseudoscience of trying to turn lead into gold.
Right.
But Riker is using it to describe the modern academic process of turning undefined terms into a currency of grievance.
Exactly. Let's look at the mechanics of how he breaks this down. Riker provides a formal example of how a classical syllogism is supposed to work.
Walk me through it.
Okay, you have a major premise. All human beings deserve dignity. You have a minor premise. Men are human beings. Therefore, the logical conclusion, men deserve dignity.
It's watertight.
It is. But Riker argues the feminist establishment doesn't use logic, they use rhetorical smuggling. They smuggle in an undefended minor premise.
Okay, how does that work?
They start with, oppressors deserve punishment. Then they introduce the smuggled premise. Men are oppressors, therefore men deserve punishment.
But they never actually prove that men are oppressors. They just assert it as an absolute axiom.
Correct. And Riker claims this creates an unfalsifiable architecture of accusation. Think about a term like privilege or toxic masculinity.
Right.
Riker points out that if you cannot define a term with enough rigorous grammatical precision to permit a refutation, then you are not making a logical claim, you are reciting a religious incantation.
So if the definition of privilege constantly shifts depending on who is speaking and what they are demanding, it is immune to logical analysis.
Yes. Therefore, it is alchemy.
And to back up that this alchemy is having a measurable, devastating effect on the male psyche, he brings in the data. He cites a 2023 Gallup poll where 43% of young men stated they feel feminism does more harm than good.
And he uses that data very specifically.
Yeah, he doesn't use this poll to say, see, we're winning. He uses it to validate that the phantom limb is a widespread, measurable phenomenon. Almost half of young men are looking at the X-ray and seeing the fracture.
Exactly.
But, okay, let me push back on Riker's premise here. Let's test the mechanics of his argument. If pattern recognition is a universal, hardwired human superpower, how does Riker address the fact that opposing ideological groups, say Marxist feminists, claim to be recognizing entirely different patterns?
That's a great question.
Because they look at the world and see a pattern of historical patriarchy and systemic bias against women, whose pattern recognition is correct.
That is the exact vulnerability you have to probe when evaluating this text, and Riker actually anticipates it.
How so?
His counter-argument is that the opposing groups aren't actually using pattern recognition at all. They are using a mechanism of social coercion and emotional manipulation. He cites Thomas Aquinas.
Wow, bringing in Aquinas.
Yeah, the broader tradition of Thomistic philosophy, to draw a hard line between subjective internal states and objective external reality.
Right, the idea that just because you feel something doesn't make it real in the physical world.
Yes. Riker insists that feelings are not facts, offense is not harm, and discomfort is not violence.
Those are very clear distinctions.
He claims the modern left operates almost entirely through emotional terrorism, weaponizing shame, guilt, and the fear of social ostracization. By contrast, he argues that the red pill epistemology must rely strictly on empirical data, classical philosophical principles, and formal proof.
So it's logic versus emotion.
Exactly. And he issues a very stark warning to his readers. The very moment you accept another person's emotional state as a valid structural premise for a logical argument, you have surrendered your cognitive sovereignty.
Man. So he's essentially trying to install a firewall in the reader's brain. He's telling them, do not engage with the emotional premise, only engage with the data.
That's his exact protocol.
And having established how he wants his readers to think, having armed them with Aristotelian logic, he then points that logical weapon directly at the institutions themselves.
Right. He moves from the internal mind to the external world.
Which brings us to his analysis of what he calls the Satanic Hydra.
It's an incredibly vivid theological metaphor, and he uses it deliberately to convey the scope of the problem.
Yeah, let's break that down.
The Satanic Hydra, according to Riker's taxonomy, is a singular organism with three heads: feminism, cultural Marxism, and intersectional DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Let's look at the mechanics of that, because usually people treat those as three entirely separate things, right? You have feminists fighting for women's rights, Marxists focused on class struggle, and DEI consultants running corporate seminars.
Right, but Riker says treating them as distinct movements is a fatal error in pattern recognition.
How so?
He argues they are not grassroots movements at all. They are a coordinated, highly synchronized, and immensely well-funded institutional apparatus designed for one singular purpose: the extraction of male resources.
And by resources, he specifically means male wealth, male status, and male innovation.
Yes, all of the above.
So if we use an engineering analogy, it's like looking at a massive global server farm. The hardware is all the stuff men historically built. The universities, the courts, the Fortune 500 corporations, the military.
The infrastructure.
Right. But Riker is saying the software running on that hardware has been completely overwritten by malicious code. The servers are still humming, but they are processing a virus.
That is exactly how Riker frames it, and he traces the source code of this hijack directly back to the Frankfurt School.
Okay, we need to unpack the Frankfurt School because this is a term that gets thrown around a lot in these spheres. But Riker actually digs into the mechanics of how they operated.
Yes. Riker focuses heavily on mid-20th century theorists like Herbert Marcuse and Theodor Adorno.
So the original critical theorists.
Right. The classical Marxist model relied on the working class to rise up against the bourgeoisie. But by the mid-20th century, the Western working class was incredibly prosperous. I mean, they had cars, houses, televisions.
They weren't exactly starving in the streets.
Yeah, exactly. They had no interest in a violent revolution. So according to Riker's reading, Marcuse and the Frankfurt School realized they needed a new revolutionary vanguard. They shifted the axis of oppression away from economics and onto culture, race, and gender.
Which is where we get the term cultural Marxism.
Exactly. And the strategy they deployed is what the German student movement leader Rudi Dutschke called the long march through the institutions.
Right. And what did that actually look like in practice?
Well, Riker argues their goal wasn't to win public debates in the town square. Their goal was to quietly conquer the very mechanisms that define truth and credentialing in a society.
So academia.
Academia first, yes. They transitioned their theories out of abstract academic sociology departments and slowly embedded them into corporate HR departments, into law schools, into the media, and into the bureaucratic state.
And Riker calls the result of this the Great Erasure.
Yes.
It's the deliberate severing of young men from the lineage of the Logos. And Logos is a term he uses constantly throughout the book.
It is central to his worldview.
It's the Greek concept of the rational, ordering, divine principle of Western civilization. It's the drive to build, to structure, to logically categorize the universe. Riker claims the Hydra is designed specifically to kill the Logos.
And to prove that this institutional capture has actually occurred, that the software is fully malicious, he brings out what he calls the patriarchy syllogism.
Okay, this is where he attempts to use his red pill epistemology to absolutely dismantle the foundational myth of modern feminism. Walk me through the mechanics of this syllogism. How does he set the trap?
He sets it up with formal precision. Premise A. The definition of a patriarchy is a societal system where men hold primary power, privilege, and control, and use that system to benefit themselves at the expense of women. That is the standard accepted definition.
Okay, that's the mod, the universally accepted definition.
Right. Then he introduces premise B, which is pure statistical data. He cites that men account for 93% of all workplace fatalities.
19%, wow.
Yes. Men account for 78% of all suicides. Men make up over 85% of the unsheltered homeless population. Men serve 63% longer prison sentences than women for the exact same crimes.
It's just a barrage of negative outcomes.
It is. And from premises A and B, he forces the reader to a logical conclusion. He states that either men are historically, comically incompetent at using their supreme patriarchal power to serve their own basic survival interests.
Meaning they're building a system that literally kills them.
Right. Or the alternative conclusion. The patriarchy narrative is a strategic, deliberate lie. It is a fabricated alibi designed to justify the extraction of resources from men while simultaneously blaming them for their own disposability.
It's a brutal logical trap. I mean, if men are in charge to benefit themselves, why are they the ones dying in the sewers and freezing on the streets?
Exactly.
And he doesn't just stick to the extremes of homelessness and workplace deaths. He gets incredibly granular about the financial extraction. He cites what he calls the health and tax gap.
This is where Riker connects the philosophical argument directly to the reader's wallet. He points out that men pay approximately 72% of all federal income taxes. They are the overwhelming net contributors to the state's treasury.
Right.
Yet, when you look at how the state distributes gender-specific health care funding, men receive only 29%. He specifically zeroes in on cancer research, noting that breast cancer receives 640% more federal funding than prostate cancer, despite relatively similar mortality and diagnosis rates.
He literally calls this taxation without representation.
He does.
He's arguing that the state treats men like a biological ATM. You deposit your labor, your sweat, and your taxes. but the state distributes the dividends exclusively to women.
And what's fascinating here is how he maps this concept of institutional decay onto the corporate world, using the concept of the Motte and Bailey fallacy.
Let's define that for the listener, just to be precise about how Riker applies it. The Motte and Bailey is an old medieval castle analogy. You have the Motte, which is the heavily fortified stone tower on a hill. It's cramped, but it's very easy to defend against an attack.
Right.
Then you have the Bailey, which is the expansive, fertile courtyard down below where all the actual living and farming happens.
Right.
But it's surrounded by a weak wooden fence, so it's hard to defend.
Exactly. So, in argumentation, a speaker makes a bold, highly controversial claim. They are out in the expansive Bailey. When someone attacks that claim, the speaker retreats to the Motte, a much weaker but completely defensible common sense claim.
Got it.
Once the attacker gets frustrated and leaves, the speaker marches right back out to the Bailey and continues making the controversial claim. Riker argues the left uses this constantly regarding DEI and equity.
So how does that play out in like a corporate boardroom?
The Bailey, the expansive radical claim, is demanding strictly proportional, equal outcomes across all demographics in every field, regardless of actual qualification, merit, or the distribution of talent. They want 50% female engineers, period. When a rational person challenges this, pointing out that men and women might have different baseline interests in systemizing versus empathizing professions, the DEI advocate retreats to the Motte. They say, whoa, all we want is to stop active, malicious discrimination. Don't you want a fair workplace?
And of course, everyone agrees with the Motte. Nobody wants active discrimination.
Right. So the rational person stops arguing.
In a moment the rational person concedes the Motte, the DEI advocate marches back to the Bailey and implements hard quota systems, effectively prioritizing demographic representation over sheer engineering competence.
Precisely. And Riker argues this is not just annoying, it is physically dangerous, and he uses a striking real-world metaphor to illustrate the deterministic danger of this philosophy. The Alaska Airlines Flight 1282 door plug blowout.
Oh wow, the Boeing 737 MX-9 incident,
Yeah.
where a panel literally blew off the side of the plane at 16,000 feet. It was terrifying. But Riker argues this wasn't just a random mechanical failure. He views it as an inevitable, deterministic result of a corporate philosophy that elevates the alchemy of equity above the logos of engineering.
He points directly to Boeing's own published diversity and inclusion reports leading up to these catastrophic failures.
He brings the receipts.
He really does. He argues that aviation is the ultimate domain of the logos. It requires ruthless, uncompromising adherence to physical reality, physics, and objective competence.
You can't fake gravity.
Exactly. Riker argues that when an HR department begins staffing engineering and quality assurance teams based on historical oppression narratives, identity quotas, and social justice metrics, rather than strict competence hierarchies, you inevitably get structural failures.
Because you cannot negotiate with gravity using a sociology degree.
That is exactly his point.
It's the difference between prioritizing the paint job and prioritizing the rivets. If you spend all your time making sure the crew looks diverse for the brochure, but you lower the standards for the guy torquing the bolts, the plane depressurizes.
And he extends this argument to corporate purges, showing how the system expels anyone who tries to reassert the logos.
Oh, right. He specifically cites the firings of James Damore at Google and Brendan Eich at Mozilla.
These are critical case studies for Riker. Let's look at the mechanism of James Damore's firing. Damore was a Google engineer who noticed the company was agonizing over the gender gap in its tech roles.
Right, the infamous memo.
Yes. He wrote an internal memo citing extensively peer-reviewed psychological research, specifically the Big Five personality model, which is the gold standard in psychometrics.
He wasn't just making things up.
No, not at all. He pointed out that on a population level, women tend to score higher in agreeableness and interest in people, while men tend to score higher in systemizing and interest in things.
He basically just cited mainstream biology and psychology to say, hey, maybe the disparity isn't because of evil patriarchal discrimination. Maybe it's just biology.
And Google's response wasn't to debate his data. Their response was to fire him for creating an unsafe environment.
Wow.
Then you have Brendan Eich, the literal creator of the JavaScript programming language and a co-founder of Mozilla.
A titan in the tech industry.
Right. He was forced to resign as CEO because it was discovered he donated $1,000 to a traditional marriage ballot initiative in California years prior.
Years prior.
Yes. And Riker points out an incredible hypocrisy here. Eich was fired for holding a position on marriage that was, at the exact time of the donation, the publicly stated position of President Barack Obama.
So the rules are entirely asymmetrical.
Completely. Riker uses these examples to prove his thesis that modern corporate institutions no longer operate on logos, merit, or even basic logical consistency. They operate purely on ideological compliance.
The HR department basically functions as a political commissariat. Okay, let me pause here and challenge Riker's foundational assumption.
Sure.
Is it possible he is falling into a conspiracy mindset? I mean, couldn't some of this institutional shift just be a really clumsy attempt at genuine course correction? Like, maybe the pendulum of history swung too far, but the intent isn't calculated malice. It's just bureaucratic incompetence.
Riker aggressively, thoroughly rejects the clumsy course correction theory.
Why?
He argues that an accusation that cannot be disproven, like systemic bias, is a prison without walls, and it is entirely by design. He insists that you do not negotiate with a parasite.
A parasite?
Yes. You don't assume the tapeworm is just clumsily trying to help you digest your food.
Right.
You recognize that the institution has fundamentally inverted its telos, its ultimate defining purpose.
Right. The telos.
The purpose of Boeing is no longer to build safe planes. It is to propagate ideology. The purpose of Google is no longer to organize information. It is to curate ideology. Riker says once the telos is inverted, you walk away.
Which is a perfect segue. We've been talking about the macro level, the big multinational corporations, aviation, macrosociology. But Riker argues that the extraction is actually most violent and most damaging down at the micro level, right?
Yeah.
In the deeply personal realms of a man's life.
Yes, he moves into what he calls the gynocentric matrix.
The family, education, and reproduction.
Let's start with the legal architecture of the family, specifically the courts. Riker views the advent of no-fault divorce as arguably the most devastating strategic victory the Hydra ever achieved against male flourishing.
Right, because before no-fault divorce, if you wanted to break a legal contract like marriage, someone had to prove a breach of contract adultery, abuse, abandonment.
Exactly.
But now you can unilaterally dissolve the most important contract of your life just because you feel like unfulfilled.
And Riker argues that family courts have a completely inverted telos. Their goal isn't justice, and it certainly isn't the preservation of the family unit.
What is their goal then?
Their goal is the maximized transfer of wealth. He outlines a very common scenario. A man works 80-hour weeks for 20 years to build a business, buy a home, and provide for his family. The court can then unilaterally dissolve that family at the wife's request, transfer the man's physical assets, remove his daily access to his own children, and garnish his future income for decades through alimony and child support.
Just a total dismantling of his life's work.
Yes, and Riker points out the ultimate insult. The system does all of this while demanding the man maintain the societal fiction that he is the one holding all the patriarchal privilege.
It's asset stripping under the guise of equity.
Exactly.
And he doesn't pull any punches when it comes to reproduction either. He has a whole chapter called the Malthusian Abattoir.
Yes, that chapter is intense.
He takes the most famous feminist slogan in history, "My body, my choice," and he translates it into what he sees as its brutal legal reality for men. Your wallet, my choice.
This is a core pillar of his argument regarding the total lack of male reproductive autonomy. He states that post-conception, a man has absolute zero legal mechanism to decline or consent to parenthood.
None at all.
If a pregnancy occurs, the woman holds a unilateral monopoly on the outcome. If she chooses abortion, the child dies, regardless of the man's desire to be a father.
Right.
If she chooses birth, the man is instantly, legally obligated to provide profound financial resources for 18 years, again, based entirely on her unilateral decision.
He essentially defines this as state-enforced indentured servitude.
He does.
He points out that in many Western jurisdictions, paternity fraud, where a woman lies to a man about being the biological father of a child and extracts resources from him for years, isn't even prosecuted as a crime.
Which is astounding when you think about it.
If you steal 10 grand from a bank, you go to federal prison. If you steal hundreds of thousands of dollars through paternity fraud, the courts often force the man to keep paying in the best interest of the child.
Because the system views male resources as public utilities.
Public utilities, that is a chilling way to phrase it.
So, as a rational, logical response to this incredibly hostile legal environment, Riker details the rise of the stealth vasectomy and the vasectomy underground.
Yeah, this part was incredibly bleak. He's talking about men in their early 20s guys who haven't even started their lives yet,
Yeah.
quietly going to clinics and getting sterilized.
Yes.
They aren't doing it because they hate children. They're doing it to structurally protect themselves from what they view as a rigged predatory system.
Oh.
They are cutting off their own genetic future just to survive the present.
It is the ultimate manifestation of the phantom limb. They are amputating their own legacy because the environment is too toxic to sustain it.
That is heavy.
But Riker argues this alienation doesn't just start in family court, it starts much earlier. It begins the moment a boy steps into the classroom.
Right. Riker views the modern university and the public school system not as places of learning, but as cathedrals of epistemological inversion and finishing schools for eunuchs.
That is some heavy rhetorical artillery.
It really is.
He points to the massive, undeniable literacy gap and college enrollment gap between boys and girls. And he argues this is a deliberate feature of the system, not a bug.
How does he justify that?
He says it is caused by the systematic erasure of what he calls the boy code.
The boy code, meaning the removal of adventure, competition, war, and heroism from the curriculum.
Yes. He explicitly notes how authors like Jack London, Robert Louis Stevenson, and Hemingway authors who dealt with the brutal physical realities of nature and male conquest have been replaced.
Replaced by what?
By sanitized therapeutic narratives focused on feelings, consensus, and emotional processing.
And beyond the curriculum, he highlights the actual pathologizing of normal male energy. The quintessential example he uses, which actually happened, by the way, is the suspension of a young boy in elementary school for chewing a Pop-Tart into the shape of a gun.
I remember that story. It sounds absurd, like a joke.
But Riker analyzes the mechanics of it deeply. He calls this symbolic emasculation.
Okay, unpack that.
The school wasn't actually afraid of a pastry. The school was using its institutional power to teach that boy, at the deepest subconscious level, that his innate masculine drive to create a weapon, to simulate combat, to be dangerous, even just symbolically, is evil, defective, and must be crushed by authority.
It is the systemic medicating and punishing of boyishness.
Exactly. And when you extrapolate that out to the university level, Riker argues this leads directly to the intellectual debt crisis.
Oh, the student loans.
Yes, you have universities issuing hundreds of thousands of degrees in what he terms intersectional victimology.
Basically useless degrees.
Degrees that have absolute zero market value. They produce no tangible goods or services, but they are propped up by hundreds of billions of dollars in federally backed student loans.
And who administers this?
An explosion of administrative bloat armies of diversity deans who produce nothing but ideological policing.
Now, to explain why the system operates this way, the philosophical analysis in the book takes a very controversial turn. Riker brings in Arthur Schopenhauer, the 19th century German philosopher.
Let me be very clear here, addressing you, the listener. We are strictly examining Riker's use of Schopenhauer's philosophy as a mechanism of his argument. We're not endorsing this.
Exactly. Riker relies heavily on Schopenhauer's 1851 essay on women. Riker uses Schopenhauer to argue that men and women operate on fundamentally different, deeply hardwired evolutionary programming.
Okay.
He asserts that modern corporate and legal systems have weaponized what Schopenhauer called female solipsism.
What does that mean in this context?
It's defined here as the inability to abstract a principle beyond one's own immediate subjective feelings.
So Riker summarizes this by saying the male mind navigates the abstract ought, like how things should logically be, while the female mind is deeply tethered to the concrete is, how things feel in the moment to her personally.
Right, and he claims that legally and corporately, a woman's feelings are now treated as carrying more epistemological weight than a man's empirical facts.
He applies this directly to the HR department, doesn't he?
He does. Think about this scenario. If a male engineer presents a meticulously researched spreadsheet demonstrating a logical flaw in a product, and a female colleague responds by saying, "The way you presented that spreadsheet makes me feel unsafe," the debate over the data instantly ends.
The facts don't matter anymore.
Exactly. The objective reality of the spreadsheet is discarded, and the subjective emotional state of the female employee becomes the new mandated reality of the corporation.
Riker argues this is the literal death of the logos.
Yes.
It's like playing a casino game where you're trying to count cards and play by the mathematical odds, but the house can just change the rules while the roulette wheel is literally still spinning, based purely on their mood.
That's a great analogy.
So here's my question as the host, trying to figure out how a guy actually lives with this information. If the legal structures, the corporate structures, and the educational structures are entirely captured by this Hydra, how does Riker advise men to navigate them day to day while they are still trapped inside. Do you just walk around in a state of perpetual rage?
Actually, Riker advises the exact opposite of anger.
Yeah.
He views anger as a loss of control, a surrender to the emotional alchemy he just spent chapters dismantling. He advises stoic composure and what he calls covert adaptation.
Covert adaptation, so surviving behind enemy lines.
Precisely. He tells his readers to comply externally to preserve their physical and financial resources, but to never, ever internalize the ideology.
What does that look like practically?
He gives very stark, practical advice. Document every single discussion regarding contraception, demand cohabitation agreements before letting a partner move in, and aggressively utilize the vasectomy underground if you are not explicitly trying to build a family.
Wow.
He explicitly states, do not seek justice from enemy courts. Recognize the pattern, adapt your behavior accordingly, minimize your footprint, and never trust the system.
Okay, so because all these legal and cultural guardrails like marriage, fault-based divorce, and traditional gender roles have been dismantled, Riker argues that we are no longer living in a structured society.
Right, the structure is gone.
We are now seeing the raw, unvarnished biological realities of the sexual marketplace, completely unleashed, and it is wreaking havoc. Which brings us to the economics of hypergamy.
This is where Riker merges evolutionary biology with modern silicon architecture. Hypergamy, defined simply, is the female evolutionary instinct to mate across and up the dominance hierarchy.
Meaning a woman wants a mate who is taller, stronger, wealthier, and higher status than she is.
Yes. And Riker acknowledges this isn't a new phenomenon.
Right, it's not like the internet invented hypergamy.
No, he argues this instinct has existed for 300,000 years, but historically it was constrained.
Constrained by what?
By the necessity of monogamy, by religion, by social shaming, and by the geographical limits of a woman's physical village. She could only choose the best man within a 5-mile radius.
Makes sense.
But now, accelerated by the silicon architecture of dating apps like Tinder and Bumble, those constraints have been completely obliterated. The hypergamous instinct has been hypercharged by algorithms.
And he backs this up with some truly staggering data. He cites leaked Tinder data focusing on the Gini coefficient.
Yes, the Gini coefficient.
Now, usually economists use the Gini coefficient to measure wealth inequality in a country like how much wealth the top 1% holds versus the middle class. But here, Riker applies it to the sexual marketplace.
And the results are shocking.
The data shows an inequality that makes modern capitalism look like a socialist utopia. The algorithms reveal that the bottom 80% of men are competing for the bottom 22% of women.
It creates a brutally stratified society. Riker calls this the two-track economy of love.
Let's break down the mechanics of those two tracks. Track A is the winner-take-all bracket.
Track A belongs exclusively to the top 10 to maybe 20% of men. Because women can now swipe globally, their attention is overwhelmingly concentrated on a tiny fraction of elite men.
And what's their experience like?
These men experience infinite abundance, unrestrained sexual access, and zero necessity to commit. They essentially have a harem on their phones.
And then there is Track B, which is where the vast majority of normal guys live.
Track B belongs to the average man, the guy working the 9 to 5, paying his taxes, keeping the electrical grid running. Riker describes his romantic experience in the modern era as one of total invisibility, degradation, and algorithmic humiliation.
He is swiping endlessly into a void.
But the profound injustice, according to Riker, is that this Track B man is simultaneously expected to pay the exorbitant taxes that fund the state welfare apparatus.
Which essentially acts as a surrogate husband for the single mothers who had children with the men on Track A.
Yes, he's funding the consequences of a party he wasn't invited to.
And the absolute final degradation of this Track B existence, according to Riker, is the OnlyFans economy.
Yes. He views the proliferation of OnlyFans not as sexual liberation, but as peak dystopian extraction.
He describes a generation of lonely, invisible men, essentially cuckolded by the internet, paying exorbitant rent for parasocial digital attention from women who would literally never look at them in a grocery store.
It is a brutal, unsparing assessment of the modern male condition.
It is brutal. And Riker connects this bifurcation directly to the imminent collapse of societal structure.
He argues that men are the fundamental engines of civilization. They build the roads, they invent the microchips, they maintain the plumbing, and they sacrifice their bodies in the military.
And why do they do all that?
Because historically, they were guaranteed a return on that investment, a stake in the future, a wife, a family, a lineage. Riker's core macroeconomic argument is that when you revoke that social contract, When you tell the average man he gets no family, no respect, and he just has to pay only fan subscriptions and taxes, the engine stops.
The men quietly quit.
And the result is a sterile empire with birth rates plummeting far below replacement levels, coasting on the fumes of past innovations.
And in this context, he does something that is incredibly taboo in modern discourse. He actually defends the incel, the involuntary celibate.
He does.
He doesn't defend violence, obviously, but he defends the demographic as a concept. He calls the incel the canary in the coal mine.
Yes. He argues that when an entire generation of young men points out that this social contract is broken, that the UD coefficient of dating has condemned them to isolation, the system doesn't try to help them. The system pathologizes their suffering to silence them.
He makes a chilling historical comparison here.
He equates the modern media's demonization of incels to the Soviet Union's practice of diagnosing political dissidents with sluggish schizophrenia.
Wow. If you disagree with the state, you aren't a rebel, you are biologically defective and need to be medicated.
Exactly.
But hold on, let me jump in here and challenge the underlying philosophy of this whole section. Riker is treating dating and human connection like a ruthless stock market. It's all pure evolutionary algorithms, Gini coefficients, and sexual market value.
It's very cool.
Doesn't Riker risk losing the very human element, the soul, the logos that he claims he wants to save? If everything is just a transactional exchange of physical assets and algorithmic status, aren't we just animals?
Riker's defense against that critique is that he isn't stripping the soul away, he is stripping the delusion away.
Okay, explain that.
He claims you cannot build a healthy, logos-driven society on the foundation of a romantic lie. You have to understand gravity before you can build an airplane. He argues that by acknowledging the harsh, uncompromising evolutionary biology of hypergamy, what he calls the hardware men can stop blaming themselves for being invisible.
Because they realize it's systemic, not personal.
Right. Once they understand the math, they can use their rational minds, the logos, to transcend the hardware.
So how do you transcend it?
He advocates for what the internet calls monk mode, a strategic, disciplined withdrawal from the marketplace of degradation.
Withdrawing from dating entirely.
He tells men, starve the dating apps of your attention and your data. Take the money and the emotional energy you would spend chasing women who view you as invisible and invest it entirely in your own sovereignty.
Build yourself up.
Invest it in a gym membership to optimize your physical hardware. Invest it in classical education to sharpen your software and build your own wealth.
Which perfectly brings us to the final act of the book. We've diagnosed the phantom limb. We've identified the mechanisms of the Satanic Hydra. We've mapped the legal traps of the Gynocentric matrix. And we've charted the brutal economics of hypergamy.
So now we need a solution.
Exactly. So what is the actual tangible prescription? Because he established early on that the purple pill trying to reform the system from within is impossible.
The cure, according to Riker's meticulously constructed argument, is not reform. The cure is the total, unapologetic architecture of exit.
He gives the reader a diagnostic tool to know when to walk away. He calls it the he-for-she test.
Yes. The rule is simple. Any institution, whether it's a church, a corporation, a university, or political party, that admits even a single feminist or DEI premise into its operating structure has already surrendered, and it is entirely unreformable.
Just one premise is enough.
If you see a corporation hire a diversity director, Riker says the institution's already dead. The parasite has reached the brain. Do not try to argue with the director. Pack up your desk.
Therefore, his ultimate protocol is build instead of climb.
Exactly. Do not waste the best decades of your life trying to reach the top of a corporate ladder that is actively rotting, where you can be fired at any moment for citing a psychological study. Build your own parallel structure.
He calls this parallel structure the New Jerusalem,
Yeah.
a new civilization built fundamentally on logos, merit, objective competence, and physical contribution.
And structurally, he leans heavily into the network state concept proposed by the tech philosopher Balaji Srinivasan.
The network state is a crucial mechanism for Riker's exit strategy. Explain how that works.
The idea is that in the 21st century, you don't start a new country by fighting a land war. You aggregate digital bargaining power first. You build a highly aligned, high-trust network of capable men online.
You form a digital tribe.
You pool your capital, you trade services within your network, and eventually, once you have enough economic mass, you use that leverage to negotiate for physical territory and legal autonomy from the legacy state.
And Riker insists that this New Jerusalem fundamentally necessitates male-only spaces.
Yes. He points out that historically, exclusive male spaces, like the monastery during the collapse of Rome in the Dark Ages, or the fraternal lodge halls of the 19th century, were the actual incubators for civilization.
They were the places where knowledge was preserved and infrastructure was planned.
He argues that men operate differently, and far more productively and truthfully, when they are not constantly performing for female approval or policing their speech to avoid offending the HR department. Male-only spaces allow the logos to function without the interference of emotional alchemy.
Okay, so that's the grand sweeping vision, but what are the actual practical tools for this digital secession? How does a guy listening to this deep dive, driving his car right now, actually begin executing the architecture of exit?
Riker is highly pragmatic here. He identifies 6 specific vectors of annihilation that the Hydra uses to crush dissent and maintain control over men.
Let's list them out.
1. Social media deplatforming. 2. Payment processor debanking, literally freezing your credit cards. 3. Domain registry seizure, taking down your website. 4. Hosting provider termination. 5. Employer firing via HR mobs. And 6. State prosecution.
So basically, total financial and social erasure.
Right. And Riker argues that to evade these 6 vectors, you must systematically migrate your life to parallel tools that cannot be censored.
Right, so for the vector of money and debanking, the tool is cryptography and Bitcoin. He describes Bitcoin as a mathematically pure ledger of truth that the HR department, the Federal Reserve, and the state cannot debase, inflate, or freeze.
For the vector of labor and employer firing, the tool is the gig economy and sovereign entrepreneurship. You must become an independent contractor or start a sole proprietorship so your income cannot be held hostage by a diversity committee demanding you list your pronouns in your email signature.
And for the vector of information and deplatforming, the tool is decentralized new media. You stop using the captured platforms and you migrate entirely to platforms built specifically to route around censorship, places like Rumble for video, Gab for social networking, and Substack for long-form writing.
And he doesn't just leave it at abstract theory. The book concludes with a highly specific 30-day praxis for the reader. It is a tactical checklist for executing the exit.
Walk me through the mechanics of this 30-day praxis.
Step 1. Open a non-custodial Bitcoin wallet and immediately convert 5% of your savings.
Yeah.
You are establishing your first foothold outside the fiat banking system.
Okay.
Step 2. Identify and monetize one independent skill that you can trade directly with clients, bypassing corporate HR entirely. Step 3. Find and join a physical, local, male-only community, a fighting gym, a shooting club, a men's group to reestablish high-trust tribal bonds.
Step 4 is intellectual. He tells you read the Western Canon. He explicitly recommends Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, or Schopenhauer, specifically to inoculate your mind against the alchemy of modern education.
And step 5 is physiological. He commands the reader to do a 72-hour water fast combined with a total dopamine detox from screens and apps.
Okay, let's explain the mechanism of a fast, because that sounds extreme to a lot of people.
Yeah.
Why is a political and cultural book telling you to stop eating for 3 days?
It's about reasserting the logos over the biological hardware. Riker points out that when you go 72 hours without food, your brain's ghrelin spikes are absolutely screaming at you. Your biology is telling you that you are going to die.
Right.
But when you successfully ignore those spikes, you rewrite your brain's relationship with impulse control. You prove to your own subconscious that hunger is merely a signal, not a command. You establish absolute dominion over your impulses.
So you become unmanipulatable.
Riker argues that if you can conquer your own survival instincts, it makes it infinitely harder for a corporation or an algorithm to manipulate you with a cheap dopamine hit on a dating app or a fear-mongering news cycle.
It is an intense, comprehensive reprogramming. But let me step back and challenge the ultimate feasibility of this entire digital secession idea.
Please do.
I see the logic of the network state. But can a parallel structure truly survive if the primary parasitic structure, the Hydra, still controls the physical infrastructure of reality? They still control the nuclear submarines, the highways, the power grid, and the IRS. Doesn't the state just eventually come with men with guns and take your Bitcoin, tax your gig income, and crush the New Jerusalem?
This is the ultimate tension in Riker's manifesto, and he addresses it head-on. He acknowledges the overwhelming kinetic power of the state, but he argues from the historical principle of obsolescence.
Obsolescence.
Yes. He notes that the massive, insurmountable Roman Empire was not destroyed by a frontal assault from the early Catholic Church. The Church didn't fight the Roman legions, it simply outlasted them.
Because Rome rotted from the inside.
Exactly. Riker's theory is that the host system, the modern Western establishment, is currently infected with a terminal suicidal meme complex because the Hydra prioritizes equity over engineering competence, because it pathologizes its builders, and because it actively punishes and extracts from its most productive net taxpayers. The host system will inevitably collapse under its own bloat and incompetence.
Just like the Boeing door plug.
Yes. Riker argues you don't need to fight the state head-on. The goal of the New Jerusalem is simply to build a watertight, fully operational lifeboat so you survive when the cruise ship inevitably sinks itself.
Wow, that is an incredibly heavy place to land. And that brings us to the end of our deep dive into the mechanics of this incredibly provocative, uncompromising text.
I will leave you, the listener, with this final provocative thought to mull over, which really builds on everything we've analyzed today regarding this demographic shift.
Let's hear it.
If Riker is right in his diagnosis that these legacy institutions are structurally unreformable, and if the most capable pattern-recognizing, systemizing men increasingly execute this architecture of exit, if they stop getting married, stop climbing the corporate ladder, and move their wealth into cryptography, what exactly happens to the host society when its primary economic and engineering engines quietly decouple and form their own sovereign digital nation?
Can a society survive when its builders simply walk away?
Exactly.
That is a chilling, fascinating question, and one that is going to define the next decade of cultural discourse. Thank you so much for going on this incredibly deep, complex journey with us today. Remember, please like and subscribe to this deep dive right now.
Please do.
We have barely scratched the surface of the dense syllogistic arguments, the historical mapping, and the raw statistical data presented in this book. If you are a red-pilled listener, a men's rights advocate, or just someone who wants to understand the exact blueprint of this cultural schism to get the full tactical nuclear device of this manifesto, you absolutely need to buy the ebook.
It's an essential read for understanding this movement.
Check Amazon Kindle and Google Playbooks right now to purchase Pattern Recognition for Men, Ungelded Androcentrism by Conrad Riker. And absolutely go follow the author at Conrad Riker on Substack to stay continuously updated on his ongoing philosophical dissections. It is a murky, volatile, diagnostic landscape out there, but hopefully, by examining the underlying logic today, we've helped clear up the X-ray just a bit. Catch you on the next deep dive.